that violence, and that destruction. It does nothing to further the cause of dismantling systemic racism. If anything, I believe it distracts from the message, which has been so powerfully raised here and across the country. We know there are protests planned for Saturday and Sunday on Capitol Hill and downtown Seattle. And the Seattle Police Department believes that some of these same demonstrations will draw some of those limited individuals who are bent on causing destruction as they did this past week. I ask everyone who's protesting this weekend, please do it peacefully. Please make sure you raise your voices and challenge government, but do it in a way that is lawful. We cannot see a repeat of what happened in Sunday, Wednesday, or what we've seen in other places. What's at stake here is significant. I'd like everyone to please consider their actions, particularly in light of the president making good on his threats to send federal forces into American cities. Our residents should continue to peacefully demonstrate and make their voices heard, regardless of this president's threat. I stand with you, but we can't pretend that his comments are just bluster. Acts of destruction, which we saw, could serve as the fodder for the president's attempts to somehow show there's a need for him to come into Seattle or other cities. This past week, the Trump administration has launched multiple efforts. One, to send federal law enforcement to cities like Chicago and Albuquerque without the request of those cities and sometimes over their direct objection. One, to send additional DHS law enforcement officers like we saw in Portland. I joined other mayors across the country sending a letter to this administration and to Congress demanding that they not send federal forces into cities over the objection of those cities. Yesterday, I was able to speak to Acting Secretary Wolf of the Department of Homeland Security. He told me directly that DHS has no plans and sees no need to send federal forces into Seattle. He stated clearly that Seattle is not Portland, and he sees that as differently. He committed to notifying Chief Best and myself should that change. I made it abundantly clear that deployments to Seattle, like we've seen in Portland, would undermine public safety and break community trust. What is happening in Portland has escalated things night after night. The Department of Homeland Security now says that they have limited number of agents in the area on standby to protect federal buildings if necessary. Contrary to Secretary Wolf's stated commitment, neither myself nor Chief Best were updated regarding the presence of these federal agents. I've worked previously with federal law enforcement. I was the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for Western Washington as a United States Attorney. I know the importance of the collaboration and partnership between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement. It is critical and it does many goods, from human trafficking to limiting the supply of heroin in our streets to limiting violence in our neighborhoods. But federal law enforcement cannot be an occupying force. To be successful, it must be a partnership with local law enforcement. Should federal forces intervene in Seattle like they did in Portland, we are prepared to take every legal step necessary. A federal judge in Portland has affirmed the ACLU's lawsuit and entered an order limiting the types of force that federal agents can use in Portland. Just this morning, 1 minute reason I'm late is I just got off a conference call with the county executive, the King County prosecutor, City Attorney Pete Holmes, and people from his office, as well as attorneys from Attorney General Bob Ferguson's office. We are united and will act together and are prepared to take whatever legal steps we need to make sure that is what happened in Portland does not happen in Seattle. I do want to take a moment and acknowledge that I know that there still is significant distrust in the community towards its government, and particularly in the way that policing is done in Seattle and America. But I also want to say, as mayor, there's nothing more important to me than the health and safety of Seattle residents. I know that we do not want to see an escalation like is happening in Portland. I am not one to escalate things myself by rhetoric or to over dramatize things. I don't think that's helpful. I think having a dialogue and a conversation about things that are happening is always important, but I can't overstate it enough. What is happening is frightening to me. Seeing the type of escalation that has happened in Portland night after night is not good for America. It's not good for any city. To me, as a former federal official, it is frightening that you would use federal agents for political purposes. And we know the president, by his own words, has stated he is doing that. He is purposely targeting cities run by Democrats. We're better than that as a country. That is not the way we operate. And I'm just urging everybody who hears my words, please don't take the bait. Don't buy into it. Be peaceful. If you come out in the streets and raise your voices, not only is it your right, but in many ways it's our obligation. But for those who are bent on destruction, those who want the fight to come, I say to you, stop. I truly believe that the events of the coming weeks could chart the course for what happens not just in cities in America, but in America as a country. I know that our chiefs, both our chief of police and our fire chief, are prepared to do everything they need to do, as are the men and women who work for them, to protect the residents and visitors of Seattle and the businesses of Seattle. But these are very challenging times. We need to be in this together. The only way we get through this is if we do it together. And with that, I will turn this over to Chief Best.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Mayor, for your words. We have experienced weeks of demonstrations in the streets of Seattle. Many of these demonstrations have been peaceful and carried meaningful messages asking for police accountability and police reform. We hear those messages, and we too are committed to re envisioning public safety here in the city of Seattle. However, the messages of peace and change in honor of George Floyd's murder and all of those who have suffered at the hands of injustice are being taken over by individuals intent on destruction and violence in our city. Two events within the last week have included wide scale property damage, destruction, arson, attacks on police that injured about a dozen officers, some significantly. This week, we know that several events are planned across the city. These events are expected to attract many of the same violent individuals of recent days. And I assume they will continue their property destruction, their arson, their looting, and attempts to injure officers that are on duty. People throughout Seattle need to be aware that the City Council ordinance banning the use of less lethal tools, including pepper spray, which is commonly used to disperse crowds that have turned violent, will go into effect this weekend. Yesterday, I sent a letter to City Council members that clearly explained the foreseeable impact of this ordinance on upcoming events. And I think it's important that you understand that as well. With the City Council ordinance, we hear loudly and clearly that the use of these less lethal tools by SPD officers to disperse crowds that have turned violent have been completely banned by the City Council. And the police department will abide by this legislation. This week, some have asked why officers did not arrest individuals who participated in criminal activity. Our officers will always investigate crimes and will make arrests when suspects are identified. As the council's legislation goes into effect this weekend, my hope is that it does not create more dangerous circumstances for our community and our officers should officers have to intervene and stop criminal activity. For these reasons, the Seattle Police Department will have an adjusted deployment in response to any demonstrations this weekend. The council legislation gives officers no ability to safely intercede to preserve property in the midst of a large and violent crowd. Allowing this behavior deeply troubles me. It deeply troubles me. But I am duty bound to follow the council legislation once it is in effect. If the council is prepared to suggest a different response or a different interpretation of the legislation, I stand ready to receive it. And let me be clear about this. We are not asking to use CS, also known as tear gas, at demonstrations, but we are asking for the ability to come with at least as many tools as we can to make sure that the public is safe. This weekend, because of this legislation, the entire police department, myself included, I'll be taking this pepper spray off of my belt and putting a riot stick on there because that's what we're left with doing. So that's what that legislation does for the city. I ask people of Seattle to do what they can to be safe, be peaceful, and help us keep the peace in our neighborhoods and in our city. I ask anyone planning on participating in the events to do so peacefully. We've experienced so much turmoil. We have experienced so much violence. And honestly, my heart is breaking for those that have been killed at the hands of injustice. My heart breaks for the young Black men who have been killed in our city in the last several weeks. My heart breaks for the officers who are just trying to do their job and have had mortars thrown at them and have been injured in front of their precinct. And my heart breaks for the many businesses who will not be able to recover because of the pandemic and the continued property damage that they're receiving. Like yours, our hearts are looking for a way to heal. I have said many times that we are a part of the community and not a part from the community. When you hurt, we hurt. And we have to move toward reconciliation together and not divided by destruction and violence. And I ask all of you to partner with the Seattle Police Department as we work toward more equitable and more safe community efforts. Already, the mayor and I have met with community leaders in West Seattle. My officers and I have walked through Ballard and Chinatown ID to listen to the concerns of the people who live there, who work there, and who visit there. We will continue to engage the community through these walks, small meetings, and virtual meetings. We are first responders, essential responders, showing up every single day throughout the pandemic because the work needs to be done. And we don't have the luxury of sitting at home in a safe COVID-19 safe environment. We're out here every single day. Some of us throughout the weekend. We don't get days off like everyone else. Our employees have been coming to work through this pandemic and the recent unrest. That work includes directly engaging the community. We are planning, we are working, and we are here listening to you. The Seattle Police Department is ready to work toward a future that is safe, that is equitable, that is fair, and we ask you to join us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Mayor, thanks for your leadership, and Chief, thank you